Welcome everybody to a Ruby and Sapphire deck tech video. I'm joined by a very good player by the name of Moyen. We are going to be looking at the set 3 version of Ruby Sapphire, but then seeing what the deck got that's new and why many players are thinking it's going to be the best deck in Ursula's return. Moyen, would you agree with that statement that Ruby and Sapphire is going to be the best deck in Ursula's return?
We're very early in the meta, but so far it looks like top 3 for sure.
Okay, so this is Moyen's rank 1 Ruby Sapphire deck from set 3. Talk to me about this deck. What was it really good at, Moyen?
So basically this deck was the destroyer of whole new world decks, where it was ramping so quickly that whole new world just became a dead card, and then because of superior card quality, it's winning the late game against basically every deck in the game. So the only issue was really getting there, and then occasionally really finding the card draw in the Popsicle Flavasham combo.
Yeah, so we saw that Amber Steel Songs was the winner of the Lille event, but that for Amber Steel Songs, the worst matchup for that deck, without doubt, is Ruby Sapphire. As you mentioned, like the deck just has lots of control tools, but then also has the way of winning the late game with the Lucky Dime.
Yeah, this deck's best matchups have always been Ember Steel, Sapphire Steel. It's also really good against Ruby Amethyst. It has been struggling a bit against the faster Emerald Steel, Emerald Amethyst deck lists so far.
Okay, but the deck's going to be looking pretty different, isn't it, moving into set 4? So, in particular, be prepared. As strong as the card is, obviously it's an action song, which means it can be discarded by Bare Necessities and Ursula. But moving forwards, there's the new Sisu card, which we're going to be taking a look at, which, of course, is a character, and that does give the deck a little bit of extra protection against those Emerald and Amber discard tools.
It's not just better against the discard tools. At the same time, a lot of decks were fine getting their board wiped with Be Prepared, especially Amethyst decks were very, very good at then refilling the board. But now this doesn't just reset the board, you also get your own character, get to develop your own character on top of it, which is a much bigger swing in tempo.
Okay then, so what we're going to do next, Moyen, is I've got all the Ruby Sapphire cards from Ursula's return. We're going to start off with the most expensive cards, kind of work our way down, and talk about which cards we think will be entering the deck in set 4. So I think the first card to talk about, we were talking about it there, is Sisu, Empowered Sibling, which is a new legendary card. It's going for a lot of money at the moment, as you can see, about $35. When I packed this card, I wasn't really convinced that it was very good, but I definitely underestimated it. When you play this character, banish all opposing characters with 2 strength or less. Moyen, how good is this card, do you reckon?
I think this is the best addition that the deck's got, that the deck has gotten, especially with another new item that we're going to talk about in a bit.
Yeah, maybe we can even go to the new item next, actually, because it's arguably the next most important card, even though it's very cheap. You could even argue the most important card.
Yeah, because just 2 strength would be a little niche of a board clear, but in conjunction with the ice blocks being there for the Flavasham and also facilitating the removal on Sisu, that's really what enabled Sisu to be a very, very strong board clear in this deck.
Yeah, so Ice Block, this 1-cost uninkable item, which you can exert once per turn, and a chosen character gets -1 strength. So very powerful with Sisu, also very powerful with Madame Medusa, even for just making trades on the board as well. For example, if your opponent has a 1 strength character, you can suddenly turn that into a 0 strength character. And of course, the more ice blocks you have, the better that can be. So for example, if you have 4 ice blocks down on the board, you could set an opponent's Madame Mim Fox to 0 strength and just remove it very, very easily. And being a cheap item, going to be a great target for Hiram Flavasham, which is still one of the best cards in the game for card draw. All right, so let's look at the rest of the cards, kind of starting off from the most expensive to the least expensive. I'm not too thrilled about a lot of the more expensive cards here, with the exception of Sisu. I do want to talk a little bit about Milan Elite Archer, because this is a very interesting card, and I think it's going to see a lot of competitive play, but it's a card which you're wanting to shift this onto another Milan, and it's going to be pretty difficult to play any of the other Milans in this deck. Ruby Sapphire tends to be a little bit more greedy with its ramp options, and so I think Milan is not going to find a place in this particular color combination, but it's definitely something to look out for example, in Amber Ruby decks.
Yeah, I think basically against this deck, if you play an early game Mulan into ramp, your opponent will have the luxury of just not exerting into certain swing turns, and then you will not really get that tempo swing that you're looking for, and that's the only scenario where you're really getting what you want out of this card.
Yeah, and when you're
While
playing Sapphire, you can just get to those 7 and 8 cost cards a lot quicker, so it's probably not quite worth it here.
plus the deck's very good at just using its hand size for inking, and then using 2 cards for 1 character is also a much bigger expense for a deck like this than for something like Mufasa. And same for Mufasa is also in Ember Ruby. When you are the aggressor, it's your opponent can't really afford to not exert their characters, where it will be much easier to punish them with a Mulan shift.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, when Moyen's mentioning 2 characters at once, that's because, of course, if you're playing a shift character down and then shifting this on, that's 2 cards out of your hand to just get 1 character on the board. And yeah, you don't have that luxury of a Rapunzel, for example, for an abundance of card draw necessarily. And overall, just seems like there's going to be better options than Mulan in this deck. One card I definitely do want to talk about, and it's not seeing play in many of the lists, but is Aerial Treasure Collector. This card in general really interests me because she has 3 strength and has ward. So she's one of the very few cards in the game which is going to be able to dodge those Sisu Ice Block combinations. Because of her ward, she cannot be targeted by Ice Block. One problem though is going to be needing more items than your opponent for her to unlock her full potential isn't going to be super consistent in this deck, especially if you're playing against something like Sapphire Steel, which has this new 1 cost steel card, which is very similar to Popsicle. Do you think Ariel could find her way into these decks at all to be a card which helps in the mirror, Moyen?
I think it would be a niche tech. Like I definitely see the idea behind it. The only problem is Ruby Sapphire was already playing a lot of uninkables in set 3, and now with the inclusion of Sisus and Icebox, I don't think that's going to change. So it might not have it might not be able to play like a tech uninkable that's only good in some matchups when it's already needing to use a lot of uninkable slots on very powerful cards that are like consistently powerful in all matchups.
Yep, I agree with that. I do think, though, definitely a card to look out for in Sapphire Steel in particular. That ward ability with 3 strength, I think, is something that can be incredibly powerful, because I do think that while we're thinking about the metagame, with how strong this Ruby Sapphire deck looks, it's also really important, therefore, to be building your other decks in a way which beats Ruby Sapphire. And of course, what that also means is if Ruby Sapphire is as popular as I'm predicting it to be, you're going to want your deck to be very good in the mirrors. So cards which could potentially give you an edge in a mirror are definitely something to keep in mind as the meta develops a little bit more. What do you think about Hercules, Moyen? Because I'm quite liking this card as like a card I just play 1 copy of in some decks as an extra copy of Maui. I think we've already mentioned this deck already has a whole bunch of uninkables it wants to play, so maybe it's more difficult to justify in this one. What do you reckon?
Yeah, this compares so unfavorably to Maui. The only upside really is being able to clear the 7 willpower locations for a single card without any board. And while that upside's there, I don't think it's big enough for me to consider this when Maui exists.
I think also with the fact that you're playing Sapphire, where you've got ramp, it's not going to be that much more difficult to play Scar, for example, in this deck. Whereas if you're playing a deck maybe like Emerald Ruby, where you don't have that ramp option, Scar's going to be a much more risky card to include. That's where Hercules could maybe see a little bit more play, but probably not going to make the cut here. What about the Super Goof, Moyen? You think this card could see any play in this deck to get a little bit of extra lore more quickly, or is it just going to be a little bit too slow, not greedy enough?
I would say wanting to get the quick 2 lore in a deck like this, I think is very greedy.
Yep.
I think you can only really afford if you're the aggressor, and then maybe you just want like this little bit of a finisher. But this deck has an incredible late game, and I don't want to lose out on card advantage to gain a few extra lore here and there.
Yep. So you're more likely to just want it to be getting lots of value off the dime rather than that lore earlier on. When I first, Moyen, was building this deck, I did definitely like the look of Bee King Undisputed, working in a similar way to Lady Tremaine. You can sing it with Flavisham, but it is just, again, another one of those uninkable cards. Do you think this could find its way into the decks at all?
I think it's an extremely powerful card, but still, the deck has so many cards that remove a character and have a body on top of it, that I'm not sure it really wants another uninkable that just banishes a character without without even developing your own. So it might be hard to fit, but it's a very strong card for sure.
Okay, this is definitely a card we need to talk about. Brawl, banish chosen character with 2 strength or less. Of course, a very powerful tool, can deal very easily with Diablo, which is going to be very popular. But with the ice blocks, this becomes an even more powerful bit of inkable removal.
Yeah, but now that you say it, I'm not sure I would play it if Diablo didn't exist. So this to me is not like a core of the deck, but this is like what we have to play to not get run over by Diablo from time to time.
Do you not think as an inkable bit of removal, though, just with the ice blocks, this is just insanely powerful? I think this card being inkable is such a big deal because a lot of the powerful control options like Beaking Undisputed are uninkable, right? Whereas this, with ice blocks, it's hard to go wrong in my mind.
Yeah, I mean it's not a bad card, but it's just not one of the first cards I put into the deck.
Okay, of course, with this legendary Sisu, there's also the option to shift it in, and there's a couple of new 3-cost Sisus. Starting off with Sisu Daring Visitor, which is a 1/1, again uninkable, which is important to bear in mind with the uninkable count running very high here. Bring on the heat. When you play this character, banish chosen opposing character with 1 strength or less. What do you think about this one, Moy? And of course, with ice blocks, if you have an ice block down on turn 1, you play Sisu. On turn 3, you could remove a character with 2 strength.
So that combination early to clear for Diablo and develop the Sisu can be strong. It might be necessary against some of the aggressive Emerald decks to have a shift target because you will need to get the 8-cost Sisu out earlier. And I think that's really where the card will shine. And I see we'll run around 2 copies in most Ruby Sapphire decks.
Yeah, I mean, in the set 3 deck we looked at, there was Queen of Hearts in there, which is a card you use on turn 2 to clear a threat. Well, Sisu can come through on turn 3 to clear a threat, and then be shifted on later on as well to clear more threats earlier than you otherwise could. So it's definitely an interesting option to be better in those matchups where your opponent's trying to be very aggressive and race you. There's also this card, this Sisu, which has got a lot of potential. Really good stat line in terms of 1 strength, 4 willpower, questing for 2 already, but then the ability, this character gets +1 strength for each card in opponent's hand. This could be a really powerful card in the early game, and obviously as an inkable shift option. What do you think about Sisu Emboldened Warrior in this deck?
So it is very well statted. It's just this deck doesn't really want a 3-cost high questing character with good stats. Like all of that sounds good, but this deck really would rather use those turns to maybe play some removal or play the Fishbone Quill, or maybe they're already at 4 ink, they want to do something else. So it's just very awkward for the curve, but it's still a decent option if you want more shift options for 8-cost Sisu.
Yeah, especially if your uninkable count is running too high. This could just be an okay card to run instead of the other 3-cost Sisu. I think you'd rather have the uninkable one, but of course it does come at the cost of being uninkable, whereas this is an inkable version of it. Okay, the new card Scuttle is a really interesting one. I've seen a lot of people very excited about it. I have to say I don't think it's going to be seeing play in Ruby and Sapphire, simply because I don't think there's enough items to justify it. It's very similar to Ariel Spectacular Singer, but with items. And with Ariel, you need around 20 songs in your deck for her to be hitting around 80% of the time. So 20 items for Scuttle to be drawing an item 80% of the time, that seems like it's going to be too inconsistent in my mind, because you're not going to be wanting to play 20 items. Would you agree with that, Moyen?
Yeah, I think the big issue is that even when it hits, it's not that powerful, but when it misses, it can like lose you games.
Yeah.
At the same time, to play Devil's Advocate, I think the biggest strength for Scuttle in Ruby Sapphire is being able to find the lucky dime more consistently in the matchups where you need it early to be closing out the game quickly.
Yeah, and I also think it's worth mentioning the fact it's a 2-cost character. Being able to sing 1 jump ahead is a pretty big deal potentially as well.
Yeah, because right now a lot of versions don't play any 1-drop or 2-drop characters at all, so it would fill that void a little bit as well.
Yep, I think it could see play, but more likely in Sapphire Steel, where you've got an abundance of items and maybe you end up playing the Aerial as well. I think it's going to have more of a home there than it is in Ruby Sapphire, would be my prediction. Do you want to talk about Snuggly Duckling?
It's nice with Scar, but I don't even want to play Scar.
Yeah, I think so too. Wasn't which card was Savage playing?
a Vitalis Sphere instead of Shield. But I don't know if it was just to test.
Yeah, what do you think about this card? Do you think it's got any legs? Obviously, one cost inkable item for Flavisham Fuel.
So the nice thing is that it enables banishing Castle for 2 less ink than Shield of Virtue does. But that's about it. This is sometimes in the mid game it will help you get an efficient trade. So it's not the worst item. The thing is, I think I want to play lots of ice blocks.
Agreed.
And then I'm not sure we need more 1-cost items to fuel the Flavisham. But if we would want more, this might be one of the first ones to look at.
I just realized this image you sent me is in German. 1 second. Before Moyen and I build our own version of Ruby Sapphire in a collaborative way, we thought it'd be pretty interesting to take a look at what some other players have thrown together for their versions of Ruby Sapphire in Set 4. So we're going to start off with Savage, who of course is very well known in the community. Very good player. Moyen, what jumps out to you in this list, which Savage is playing here?
In general, there's a few things that make me think this was built to also be good in the mirror, where they were maybe expecting the stack to do well and then facing it a lot. Because one, the stack plays Scuttle to find the Lucky Die more consistently, which is a good card in the mirror. It plays one Judy Hopps, which it's only really needed in the mirror. Sometimes it can help against, in set 3 it used to be able to help against Ember Steel Flutes.
Yeah, so Judy Hopps in the mirror really good at banishing the opponent's Lucky Dime.
And at the same time, I think lots of versions have been cutting the bell, while Savage opted to keep 2 bell in there, which again helps to close out the grindy games out a little bit quicker.
Yeah, one thing which definitely catches my eye on this one is no copies of Brawl and only 3 Medusas, 2 Sisus, 2 Ice Blocks. I'd personally be more tempted, at least initially, to be trying 4 Ice Blocks and be more heavy on these cards like Medusa, Sisu, and Brawl that have that Ice Block synergy.
Plus, this actually plays a Maurice Workshop, which is like a very much a somewhat slow late game card draw tool. So that's exactly my thinking as well. Where I think the stack is tailored towards beating the mirror. I think it might struggle against Emerald Steel or in general Emerald Diablo decks, because the Diablo will just get on average a little bit more card draw value for the Emerald player than would be possible if you were upping the count of Brawls and Sisus.
Yeah, and also with those 3 copies of Be Prepared, it's definitely giving Emerald an opportunity to be discarding Be Prepared. But that's a really interesting thing about these lists. Previously, Ruby Sapphire, you would always be playing Be Prepared times 4. But now with the Sisu, you've kind of got 2 different board clear options. So it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of ratio players end up with. I would wager you're going to have a bit of a balance. You're going to have some Sisus and some Be Prepareds. Do you think there's an argument to cut the Be Prepareds altogether, Moyen?
You could do it, but I think there is still some value in the threat of the full board clear still being possible regardless of the strength on the characters. So it's possible that might still be 1 or 2 in the later list. I think it's similar to how in set 3 the Medusa Tremaine split in the meta was ever changing, and now it might be similar for like the Sisu Be Prepared split for board wipes.
Okay, so for these next ones, I went onto the 20 Law Pro Discord, which is a nice community of some good players, and just picked up a few random lists which had been posted there just so we could get a little bit more insight into what people were using. Pretty similar looking list, this one with a couple copies of Brawl. Does also have both of those 3-cost Sisus. We're seeing Grammatala, the 4-cost card, being played in a lot of these, as well as How Far I'll Go. I think a lot of players would be tempted to be dropping both of these cards, Moyen, but do you think Grammatala and How Far I'll Go are important to this deck still?
Yes, very much. I think it would be hard to get me off 4 copies of each. I think that the dig in this deck is incredibly powerful from Grammatala, but even more powerful, I think, is the singing How Far I Go or the 1 jump ahead into How Far I Go to like ramp a lot without sacrificing too much cards in hand.
Yeah, when I was doing the broadcast over in Lille this weekend, I got to cast a game with Steve Warner, and I asked him what his favorite card was, and he said it was How Far I'll Go.
So. Yeah, it might be my favorite card too. It was because it wasn't played a lot. I think Savage was one of the only ones that was advocating for it in set 3, and then at some point I stopped being ignorant and also tested it for a lot of hours, and then was like advertising how far I go with him, and then over time suddenly, I think it's more common Ruby Sapphire lists play how far I go than not.
Yeah, and
And also
obviously,
at one of the set championships, they were giving out promo cards and it was how far I go, and it was very funny.
nice. Obviously, the benefit as well of playing Grandma Tala and How Far I'll Go is Grandma Tala can also sing How Far I'll Go herself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Maui being able to sing a card like How Far I'll Go is pretty powerful if your opponent's trying to deny your Maui value. Of course, being a Russian reckless, it cannot quest, but it is still able to sing songs.
Yeah, it's not just the 4-drops. It's basically, as you said, the Maui, but also the Medusa are like high cost characters that can sing high cost songs, but they have a lot of impact when they hit the board. But then the turn after, they don't actually do that much. So they're like very, very good at singing more expensive songs.
Amazing. Up next, we have Lorcana Lingo with a similar looking deck. This one with 1 copy of Shield of Virtue, 1 Scar as well, and even a Maui's Fishhook. Do you think any of these cards interest you, Moyen?
I don't think we need Shield of Virtue, or especially I don't think we need the Fishhook. I think we have enough good, efficient, inkable 1-cost items where I don't really think we need the 3-cost item. What really jumps to my mind is seeing the 3-1 jump ahead. I don't think that is legal.
You'd always play 4? Why is that?
Yeah. I mean, it's by far the best play on 2 in every single game. It's in this deck doesn't play Scuttle or anything, so it's also your only play on turn 2.
Yeah.
Except just cycling items and playing Develop Your Brains.
Yeah, and 1 jump ahead can
yeah.
feel bad a lot of the time, but with Fishbone Quill down as well, it's just an easy card to put into your Inkwell if necessary as well, if you don't want to spend the 2 for it.
Yes, this is very much worth the uninkable slot.
Just to show you guys a few more, we have Hopeless's take, looking pretty similar, also with some of those 3-cost Sisus. Only 2 copies of How Far I'll Go, but has 3 Sisus, 3 Ice Blocks, 2 Be Prepared, and only 2 copies of How Far I'll Go. What do you think, Moyen?
I think you'll be missing the 3rd and 4th copy of How Far I'll Go. Other than that, this deck really wants to get rid of Diablo and be able to shift into Sisu consistently. So it's like more tech towards the Emerald side of the matchups.
Okay, Moyen, so it's finally time for us to build our own 60-card deck, and we're going to do it in the Speci deck building way, which is, of course, put the best card in the deck first, rinse and repeat until we arrive at 60 cards. What is the first card in the deck, Moyen?
I don't think the deck works without the card draw of Flavasham.
Yes,
so
it's the Toy Maker. Agreed. Talk to me about Flavasham.
It's honestly it's the only card in the game that made me want to watch the movie immediately just because of how good the card is.
So what film is Flavasham from?
It's The Great Mouse Detective.
I remember you telling me that you didn't enjoy the film. Is that right?
Yes, but I still watched it.
So if we've got the Flavasham, I guess we should also put some items in the deck as well.
So we'll start with the popsicles.
Still 4 copies of Popsicle every time?
Yes, I would play more of them if I could, but that's Deal's turn.
And of course, I think the new Ice Block is definitely going to be in the mix. I think the biggest question really on this card is how many copies of it do you run?
Yeah, so it's not one where I'm sure you want 4, but maybe.
Yeah, I would personally lean towards 4, just being a 1-cost item that can be such high impact. I think you also get a lot of value at stacking Ice Blocks, and you're going to be wanting to sacrifice your Ice Blocks to the discard pile to draw cards, and I think having those extra copies of it is going to mean you don't feel bad about doing that, right? Like if I've got 2 Ice Blocks on the board, I can use 1 to draw cards of Flavasham, and then I can keep the other one on the board for a little bit longer if necessary to give me a little bit more control. I could definitely see a world where you play 3 copies because of the fact that you are going to want to play a whole bunch of uninkable cards. But to me, if it wasn't for the uninkable nature of this card, it would definitely be a card I play 4 copies of. So I'm going to put 4 in for the moment, but it's definitely a card that we might reduce the count of if we need to reduce the uninkable slots.
Agreed. I think next we should put in all the ramp tools of the deck.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan.
So 4 1 jump ahead, 4 Quill.
So any argument to play Mickey Mouse in this deck over something like Fishbone Quill?
It's somewhat better against Emerald sometimes when you don't draw Lava Shine, but that's not enough of a reason. Basically, with the 1 jump ahead on 2, the Mickey Mouse on 3 is a lot less efficient because you already have 4 ink a lot of the time on 3. So in Sapphire Steel set 3, we used to play Mickey Mouse on 3, but that's only because we had the incredible Smee on 2 instead of the 1 jump ahead on 2. And then it makes a lot more sense.
All right, so we've got our item package of Flaversham. We have the ramp cards. I guess we should probably put Sisu in the deck next as like the new big powerhouse card. Would you say that's the next most important?
I'd go Grammatala next. I think the dig and develop your brain. Those are like still very much core.
Okay, develop your brain. I'm really glad you mentioned. I mean, Grammatala works in a very similar way to develop your brain as well, but just with a body. What is it about develop your brain that you think is so important? Because I agree. I've made the point in a lot of times in the past, which I think develop your brain, you could make a case for it being the best card in the game. Just that amount of consistency is really quite amazing. Why do you think this card is so important?
It's basically because so early game you have to get ahead in resources, stabilize the board, maybe get some card draw, but then you need a way to consistently be able to actually use your resources, and it's very easy to have this one extra ink to be able to fit into your turns, and then just being able to respond to situations with the tools that you put into your deck for these situations is like very, very powerful. And it's inkable, and it's like never a bad card.
Yeah.
If you're low on inkables in your starting hand, you might ink it, but that's fine. And if you're like middling on inkables, you can still try to dig for your 1 jump ahead or 2, your Quill on 3. Later in the game, maybe you can only win if you get a Medusa this turn, or B-Prep, or Sisu, or maybe you need to look for the dime. So like, the dig is incredibly important to how this deck functions.
Yeah, and I think this is the kind of card which a lot of people, when they're building their decks, will, if they've got, let's say, 64 cards that they want to play, develop your brain is an easy card to cut. But this is why I really love building the deck in this way, where you can just see, okay, what are the most important cards? And then you don't end up cutting these cards. Like Moyen is saying, this card is this important. It's going to be in place of other things. It's a consistency tool. A lot of the time I compare not playing Develop Your Brains to playing a 64 card deck. It's not, of course, exactly the same, but it's that same kind of concept where just play the real consistency tools, which are always good, just in a similar way how you wouldn't play a 64 card deck. Would you agree with that analogy at all, Moyen?
Yeah, so why choose? It's basically how I would put it is why choose to play 60 card deck when you can play like 57-ish card deck.
Yeah.
Where it's like even more consistent than that. So I think the only reason people don't play it is because they really don't. They're not good at choosing what cards they want to play, and then.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people, they end up with, it's very easily done. You end up with a deck with like 70 cards, 76 cards, and then you end up trimming down. And it's cards like this which often get cut. And that's why when I build decks, I love doing it in reverse order as we're doing here, where it really helps you to see the value of certain cards and makes you just make more, in my opinion, it's easier to make decisions when you work in reverse order rather than trying to cut, because cards like this, which are so powerful, are often what end up getting cut. And I don't think that is always leading to the most optimal builds.
Grammatala is similar to Develop Your Brain. It's of course much more expensive, but it can fit the 1 jump ahead curve very well. It's good at singing how far I'll go, and at the same time, it's another card that will make you not lose out on late game, because like even if you have more resources than your opponent, you might get like a little bit of a clunky hand, or maybe your Maleficents don't have good targets right now, and then what do you do? But being able to fit in a Grammatala in a few of these turns can also smoothen out these turns a lot.
Amazing. Okay, so we're on 32 cards, so we're more than halfway there. What's up next, Moyen?
I realized we are on Sapphire cards only, but they really are the core of what this deck does.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. So maybe it's time to get some Ruby cards in here. In fact, before we even go to Sisu, let's go to Maui, shall we?
Sure.
Any arguments for playing less than 4 copies of Maui?
I don't really think there are valid arguments. This because of you spending the early turns ramping, your opponent will be trying to get the early lore in, and then Maui can often 2-for-1 or even 3-for-1. And if you were not to play, in a lot of spots, if you don't have the Maui, you are weak to locations. So this is the one tool that this deck really has that's very, very good against locations too.
Yep, absolutely.
Next, maybe we have the Meta Tyrant in Medusa.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's time to look at the control tools, and I think Medusa already going to be a really good card in previous sets, but now with the ice block becomes an even bigger threat.
I was already playing in set 3. I was often playing 4 Medusa 0 Tremaine or 4 Medusa 1 Tremaine. And I don't see a reason to go off for Medusa
I
at all.
agree. Especially with the ice block, I think this card you're just playing 4 copies of in this deck. Okay, we have 20 cards left. Maybe it's a good time to check how many uninkables we currently have, Moin. Currently already at 16 uninkables, but we do, of course, have the Fishbone Quill in there as well as the Develop Your Brains and Grandma Tala's How Far I'll Go. So we're going to have some opportunities to put uninkable cards on the bottom of our deck or into our inkwell through those means.
And this deck will definitely, as its late game engine, it will still need a few more uninkables, if either for board wipes or also for finishing the game with lucky dimes.
Yeah, I think we need to put the dime in the deck, right, as a way of finishing the game off.
Yes.
How many copies? Do you ever go to 3 copies, or is 2 the magic number for lucky dime?
I think this deck with all the draw that it has, plus 4 Develop Your Brain, 4 Grammatada, 4 How Far I'll Go, it is consistent enough at finding dime even on 2 copies.
Yeah, and the other thing to consider if we do want to go for the Crabatoa, as you told me it was called earlier on, even if your lucky dime gets removed, the Tamatoa could potentially put it back into your hand as well. Okay, we've got 18 slots left, so we're running out of slots. Obviously, Sisu and Be Prepared, I think, maybe are the cards we could go to next for that late game control.
Yeah, we could also just put in the Kravatoas together with the lucky dimes that we already have, because this will be the most potent target a lot of the times for the lucky dime.
And it's also an inkable card, which can be, of course, very important. A lot of these cards that you're wanting to play in the late game are uninkable. So Tamatoa being an inkable big powerhouse card can also put ice blocks and popsicles from your discard back into your hand, and you can then replay those again. Do you think it's going to be 4 copies of Tamatoa?
Yes, it's definitely 4. It's basically ramping into it early when it doesn't get removed. It just draws you an extra card a turn, which is incredibly powerful, and it is not easy to remove with a 5/8 stat line.
Okay, we've got 14 slots left. I think it's Be Prepared and Sisu time. Do you agree?
Yes.
So
both of these are not necessarily 4 off, so we have to figure out the split on these cards.
Yeah. Personally, I'm liking the idea of 4 Sisus with 4 ice blocks.
I think that could work. I think it maybe we'll end up wanting 3, but I'm also on 3 or 4 copies of Sisu.
I'm gonna go to 4, and then we can maybe at the end of it, we can start reducing the count of some of these cards to 3 in order to fit everything in that we want.
And then for Be Prepared, I think I'm less sure about the exact count. I think it might be between 0 and 2.
Yep.
Which is a big range, but I think it will take lots of testing whether other decks will be able to really punish this deck for running a low copy of Be Prepared, or whether this deck can totally get away against the other meta decks just with their strength-based removal in Sisu Be Prep War.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you that it's going to be lower count than Sisu. I have to say, though, I don't see a world in which you run 0 copies of this card. I think at least even just 1 copy could give you something a little bit different and could be a nice way of going. Personally, I think 0 copies in a closed deck list format, maybe because your opponent might still play around it to respect it, but I have a feeling that it might just be worth including 1 at least.
It might definitely be. It comes online a turn earlier. It is worse against the Ursula Deceiver, and I think it's still possible. It might be 0 copies, but it's basically because if you want to punish them for not having Be Prepared, usually it's by going very wide, and I think these very wide boards often will be weak to Sisu as well.
Yep. Let's put 1 in for now, if that works with you.
Yes.
Okay, so we've got the 8 cost Sisu. I guess let's talk about the 3 cost Sisus.
So as we talked about in the intro, I'm not a big fan of the inkable Sisu because it's just this mid-range type threat. Yes.
Yeah, I think this card's got a lot of potential, but not sure that I can really see a world where I'm playing it like on turn 3, we're more likely to be wanting to go for the Grammartala if we played one jump ahead on turn 2, or the Fishbone Quill. So this is pretty far down the pecking order.
And then the other 3-cost Sisu is very interesting. It is evasive, but it can't trade into the Diablos or the 3/3 Pegasus or the actually evasive threats in the meta. So, but it can maybe get some lore before shifting. My issue with the card is that it is uninkable in like an awkward ink slot for the deck, as we said with the other Sisu, you don't really want to be playing 3-cost characters. And even with ice blocks, I think it could happen reasonably often that you don't have a good target for this, and then you're stuck with an uninkable, especially in games where maybe you don't quill. So I think this card, while it has a lot of upside, it has a high cost of putting it into the deck.
Yep. So we're
reason,
currently at 51 cards, Moyen, and currently 23 of those are already uninkable. And of course, we could start to reduce the count, and a lot of people are going to be losing their minds that the uninkable count is so high already. I will mention though, with cards like One Jump Ahead, How Far I'll Go, with the Fishbone Quill, Develop Your Brains, Grammatala, Flaversham, all these are really allowing this deck to play a lot more uninkables than you usually would, and there's so much value in a lot of these uninkable cards. Do you have like a limit of uninkables that you would ever play in this? Do you think that's a good way of looking at it?
So I don't love these like hard limits.
Yep, same.
For me, it's just like putting an uninkable into your deck has an attached cost for consistency and variability in your gameplay. And that cost goes up for each uninkable that you already have in the deck. So like the 24th uninkable has a higher cost than the 23rd, if that makes sense. But I'd never put like a hard limit on it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's also just going to come down to player preference as well. I think if you're a more experienced player, you're going to be more comfortable with the higher uninkable count, whereas if you're someone that's less experienced, it definitely makes sense to stay lower on the uninkable count. It's going to change the way you mulligan potentially as well, right?
Yes. So with more uninkables in deck, you're like a little bit more inclined to sometimes keep something that you wouldn't keep otherwise, just to have like a little bit higher consistency for ink. I think for Sisu with being on 23 uninkables already, I would go for 1 copy for now.
I can get behind it too. Yep, I could see it going to 2. Would definitely like to play more copies of this card, but yeah, the uninkable count is incredibly high already.
Then I think next up, especially with a low amount of B prep, we need some removal that actually is able to remove like higher strength characters that we can't remove with strength-based removal. And I think that would be Maleficent Monstrous Dragon.
We haven't even mentioned the dragon. This is a card which a lot of the time you're seeing 4 copies of in many of the Ruby Sapphire decks in the past metas. Do you think that's going to remain the same? Again, the value in this card is it's able to deal with those cards which do have a lot of strength, but also it's very importantly inkable.
Yeah, this is one of the cards that's inked the most, but it still plays an important role in the deck where you get to 2-for-1 big threats, regardless of their size.
So 4 copies?
Yes.
Agreed. And this means we only have 4 slots left. And of course, we could reduce the counts of some of the cards like Ice Block to 3, similarly with the Sisus. But at the moment, we don't have any copies of Brawl in the deck, and Brawl is definitely a card I would love to get quite a few copies in personally.
Yeah, I don't think that the card's incredible in the deck baseline, but I think with Diablo being the other meta tyrant in the early set 4 meta, I can get behind playing 4 copies of Brawl.
Yeah, I agree. I would like to play 4 copies of it. All right, well, that's 60 cards. Is there anything that we've not talked about that we want to add?
I think I'm happy with this list.
I think I'm happy too. That was easier than I expected it. Okay, cool. Well, Moyen, I guess it's been a pleasure. Let us know in the comments if you agree with this 60 cards. I'm going to save it, and I'll pull up a full image, and then we can talk about the list a little bit more.
I have a lot of lists.
Yeah, kind of true. Okay, so let's look at the list quickly. What we finally arrived on: 24 uninkables, which is certainly a lot. So you could absolutely consider reducing the counts of Ice Block and the 8-cost Sisu. But do you think 24 uninkables is going to be okay for this deck?
I think it's still going to work. It's definitely a little bit on the higher end, but it's within reason.
Yeah, I also personally am of the opinion that as we continue to get a bigger card pool, I think it's going to continue to be the case that the uninkable counts of a lot of decks are going to increase because some of these uninkable cards are just so inherently powerful and you want to maximize the amounts of copies you can play of them because there's a reason they're uninkable. They're better than inkable cards on average. And if ever there's a ink color which can get away with playing a lot of uninkables, it's going to be Sapphire because of the ramp. If you can just get to 2 ink, that suddenly the one jump ahead is going to open up your hand quite a bit already on its own.
Yeah, it's for multiple reasons. It has a lot of dig, it has card draw, it has the fishbone quill to ink uninkables, it has the uninkables that it does play often give ink themselves.
So I think one weakness that we can potentially identify of our deck here is the fact that we have very few characters coming and hitting the board in the early game. So definitely up in the count of Sisu, Daring Visitor, maybe some Queen of Hearts. Do you think that you could see a world where these kinds of cards increase the count of those and reduce the count of some of the more expensive control tools?
Yes, if the meta warrants it, this deck might need to adjust because right now it doesn't impact the board at all in the first 2 turns where it can get easily punished by especially the set 3 Cursed Merfolk.
Mm-hmm.
But right now Emerald is favoring the Bucky lists, which actually enables this list to not play Queen of Hearts for now.
Yep. Now, I guess that's the other thing moving forwards. We should probably mention that this take on the deck is kind of like the standard setup, but it's very likely that as the meta develops, that this deck will change in order to have more favorable matchups to the other top decks. I think in particular, building this deck in a way which succeeds heavily in the mirror could be a really interesting idea. I do want to mention McDuck Manor as a potentially very interesting card to enter into this deck. Could you see a world where McDuck Manor is played?
Yes, McDuck Manor has been incredible in the mirror. I think it's still incredible in the mirror, but it is. I think in this deck it doesn't do a lot against a lot of other matchups. So it's definitely just a mirror attack.
Is there any other deck cards which really come to mind which might help you out in the mirror?
I think Bell could help you. I think maybe the Scuttle could help you a little bit to find. Is it called Scuttle? The 2-drop that finds an item. Could help you get the dime online earlier, which is incredibly important in the mirror. That's basically it. Maybe the 6-cost aerial, but I'm not sure you want to use an uninkable slot on it.
Yeah, I think the 6-cost aerial, even in the mirror, is going to be a little bit awkward because your opponent is playing items as well, and she might just be questing for 3. I think also worth mentioning Judy Hopps as well, right? We don't have any copies of her in here, but we talked about earlier Judy Hopps being able to banish your opponent's lucky dime can definitely be quite impactful.
Yep.
All right, Moyen, it's been an absolute pleasure. Where can people find more of your content?
Thank you for having me. I occasionally stream on Twitch or on Lorcana's YouTube, and I'm also part of the Lorcana podcast with Brandon and Karma, which is weekly episodes usually on Friday.
Awesome. Well, we're going to be hanging out again in a few days at UK Games Expo. Hopefully we can get some games in, and looking forward to having you back on the channel very soon.
Bye-bye.